So where have we got to? I've introduced you to John Conway's Game of Life, and I've introduced you to that for two reasons, perhaps three. The first is that it strikes me as an interesting metaphor for many things that we see in the field of education. I think of myself, perhaps my intellectual activity. Today I'm interested in comparison. Tomorrow I might be interested in history. The day after I might be interested in literature. Today some areas are fizzing and buzzing in my thoughts, and other areas are dormant and not much happening there. And a few days later, different parts of my mental activity will be blossoming, and other parts that I've been active on today, obsessed with today, will have fallen out of use. And the most exciting things that happen normally are when an inspiration from one area fires off like a glider, lands in some quite distinct area, and we get biochemistry, astrophysics, when a glider from one area sparks off and goes into another area. I think that Conway's Game of Life is an interesting metaphor for many of the things that we see in education. No, it's obviously a metaphor for life. If you think of it as being like plants growing in a forest, they're only affected by their immediate neighbours. They like to be uncrowded, but they like to be among shelter of similar species, but they don't like to be overcrowded. Think of it like weeds growing through my garden, spreading. They only affect immediate neighbours, but a pattern develops as they spread over the whole garden. It's got a lot of features that inspire comparisons of that sort, and that's one of the reasons it speaks to me to aspects of education that perhaps are under-examined in the traditional theoretical frameworks that we have. One of the things I think that we never explain to young teachers, so certainly one of the things I was never told before I became a teacher, I thought that if you took 30 children at random, you would get a class, and one class would be very much like another class. It doesn't work like that. Sometimes the individuals in the class spark off each other, goad each other into more activity, stimulate each other to compete, and they're interested in asking questions. They're trying to find out as much as they can in order to develop their knowledge and satisfy their curiosity. And other cases, nothing happens. There are 30 people, individuals in the room, and they don't spark off each other. It's like the difference between those areas of the Game of Life where things are fizzing and buzzing and areas where there's nothing much happening. And as a teacher, well, yes, of course, you have some opportunity and some responsibility for nudging the class towards the fizzing and buzzing activity area. Well, I thought that was my job. I've had colleagues who thought that their job was to nudge it towards the nothing happening, quiet and predictable kind of outcomes. But I thought my job was but either way, whichever way you look at it, the teacher has some responsibility, but they're not totally answerable for what happens in the interactions between individuals in the classroom. You can't make necessarily an inactive and dormant class into an active and fizzing and buzzing class. Sometimes you just get what you get, and the teacher can't do very much about it. So I don't think I was warned about that. I thought that having had one good year with the classes, I was knowing much, the next year would be equally good. Not necessarily. Sometimes there are just ups and downs that you don't have any control over. So the first reason I introduce you to the Game of Life is that it's an interesting metaphor for many of the things we see in education. But the second is that it's helping us to think formally about comparison. And in that respect, I want to think about comparison is actually an activity we do practically automatically as soon as we start speaking. that kind of informal comparison happens all the time. But when we're trying to be formal about research and we're trying to be formal about explaining events that we see before us, then we need to be more careful over the comparison and design and describe and focus on the features that we wish to emphasize. So today, I might tell you that all people are the same. We all have equal human rights, we all have certain aspirations, we have similar patterns of growth and development. People are just people. But tomorrow I might want to emphasize specific differences. I might want to talk about the difference between men and women, the differences in the way children and adults think. I might want to emphasize differences, and for each comparison I should set out formally what it is that I'm comparing and what it is that I want you to focus your attention on, because I'm reminded of one of the pupils I taught a very long time ago in school when I used to teach science. And we were doing an experiment, and I said, with this experiment, what I want you to do is to take a beaker full of water, heat it gently over a Bunsen burner, and drop a crystal of potassium permanganate into it. Drop the potassium permanganate in, and you will watch convection currents as the water circulates. And this little boy said to me, we did this experiment last year, sir. And so I said, well, really, I was rather taken aback. I wasn't there, I was a new teacher, so I hadn't been there the previous year. So I said, tell me, what did you do then? And he said, we took a Bunsen burner, put water in it, put it over, beaker of water over a Bunsen burner, and we dropped in custard powder, and the custard powder, it went thick and it made custard. And that was the experiment. And I said, well, yes, that was the experiment you did last year. This is a completely different experiment. You're dropping potassium permanganate crystals in to watch the convection currents. Last year, you were watching the effect of heat on starch, corn flour. And he said, well, it's the same experiment. Beaker, Bunsen burner, water, heat it up. And of course, he's absolutely right. In one level, that's the same experiment. But it was to demonstrate different principles, and it was asking them to focus on different elements. So that when you're comparing, you need to be explaining what it is that you are comparing. So that in that formal sense, be careful about how you generate, how you create your comparisons. And the third reason I'm introducing John Conway's Game of Life to you is that it's an introduction to formal modelling. It's a very simple rules, very simple understanding of what's going on when neighbours interfere with each other, influence each other, but it generates from those simple rules patterns that we can look at and draw some conclusions about systems where we've not understood the rules, where we've not made the rules, where we're trying to understand what's happening. After looking at John Conway's Game of Life for many occasions, I started to become curious. I noticed that you see on the screen very often a simple pattern. You see 4 oscillators together, synchronized so that they're either that way on, or when they oscillate the other way, they form a square. Going backwards and forwards between a cross and a square. And I was fascinated by that because it seems a very unlikely thing to happen. It seems that it involves 12 cells arranging themselves in that pattern, and that seems relatively unlikely. Remember, the glider The glider involved 5 cells organising themselves at random. And that happens occasionally. If you watch carefully, you can see the gliders in the pattern. 12 cells arranging themselves at random seems much less likely than 5, infinitely less likely than, orders of magnitude less likely than 5 organising themselves at random to have this. So what's going on in this pattern? We know that they don't influence each other, they don't touch. We know the rules, we've set up the rules. John Conway told us the rules and we understand the rules. This 3 cannot interfere with that 3, cannot interfere with that 3, because they are not in contact with, they're not in that sense neighbours enough to have an influence on each other. So why does this pattern happen so often compared with that pattern, when this pattern seems to be so much less likely? Now, first thing to go away and ask oneself is that a fair comparison? This pattern, the oscillator over here, 4 oscillators together, once they're going, once they're set running, they will run forever. They're not but touching each other, but once they're, each generation they switch backwards and forwards. They had to be synchronized in the first place, but once they're synchronized, they're running and they will run forever. The glider will not run forever because it's moving, and in the nature of things it will bump into something, and if it bumps into something it changes. It either changes into something more active or something that's not active at all. But it changes, so it lives only as long as it's moving from one area to another. This thing, this box, cross, square, whatever it's called, once it's running will last forever. So are there in fact a lot of these, or are they just lasting for a long time? They're perhaps less common than gliders, but once they're running, they run forever. So what's a fair comparison? What should we be comparing? Do these happen more frequently than we would expect, or do these things happen more frequently than we would expect? So there's a whole set of new questions about what's a sensible comparison. And again, I have to explain, you have to explain if you're using comparisons, what the framework is that you're comparing in. And I was puzzled by this pattern. Wasn't puzzled immediately as soon as I saw John Conway's Game of Life, but after watching it for some time, I became interested in this puzzle, this pattern, and why it occurred so frequently. And I went back to as what you will when you're puzzled, I went back to the literature and I discovered that this pattern was in fact one of the patterns that John Conway had drawn particular attention to in the first paper that was published about the Game of Life. So it's a long-standing interest. That's a good piece of advice, by the way. When in doubt, go back to the literature and check. I could have saved myself a lot of time and trouble if I'd read the literature carefully first. I'm not sure what to advise you about that. Sometimes it's a good thing to read the literature beforehand, and sometimes it's a good thing to go away and think about things on your own. And when you come back to the literature after that, you can see what the person who's writing the literature was getting at. Here's the problem. That seems to be an unlikely pattern to arrive at random, and yet it occurs all over the place. Either 4 of them together, or sometimes one of them been knocked off by a passing piece of activity, a glider or some other activity. You'll see scraps of that pattern all over the place on the screen if you look carefully. So the last thing I want to say to you about a formal model like this that we're running on a computer is that it has the great advantage over real life that you can run it backwards. So I could take one of these patterns and I could run the program backwards through generations to see where it came from, and I arrived at this pattern. 4 cells arranged, and on balance 4 cells arranged at random seems more likely than 5 cells arranged at random. So this pattern I expect to happen quite frequently, and a little more frequently than gliders, and watch what happens when that pattern goes through a few generations. So there you have it. There you have John Conway's Game of Life. That pattern that I said here will arise quite often, and it produces this set of 4 oscillators. And although we know from the rules that we've understood that those 4 oscillators have nothing in common now, they have a common origin in history. And here again is a metaphor that you might think of in educational terms. For similar things, we see a pattern, but is the pattern there today, or is it a common origin in history? Do schools all look the same? Wherever you go around the world, schools look the same. Do schools look the same because colonial educators from Europe went out into the world and took with them a style of schools that then was adopted around the world? Do they have a common origin in history, or do they have a functional commonality, that they perform a similar function in different societies, and those similar functions lead to similar form? If we traced those schools back, would we find a common history? Do we all do examinations that look very similar because we inherited the Chinese imperial examination system through the British civil service, through Oxford and Cambridge, and then onto the world? Do all examinations have a common history, or do they have a common format because they perform similar functions? It's a question that arises again and again in complex systems. Are bats and birds related because they've both learned to fly, or do they have similar structures because they have a common function in flying, and so they develop in parallel? So we need to ask questions about the comparisons. What are we comparing? What are we looking for? Is it common origins, or is it common functions that we're comparing? And all of that comes out of this discussion that I've offered you today of John Conway's Game of Life. It's a classic of its type. Let me finish just with one last demonstration. Because this is on a computer system, we can change the rules. And if we change the rules so that instead of following Conway's rules, we say that a cell will survive if it's got a majority of neighbours are alive, and it will die if a majority of its neighbours are empty cells, and then we can see what will happen. And you'll see that really for quite small differences, the cells and the living and the dead areas aggregate together. And I'll run you this last sequence through so that you can see that. And again, what we're seeing here is a metaphor. Imagine you live in a large city, as I live in a large city, and people, by and large, prefer to live with people who are from a similar culture to their own. It's not an absolute thing, it may not be a very strong tendency, but even a quite small tendency means that people tend to group together, form themselves into communities. I live in an area of London where there are quite a large number of Greek Cypriots. The community is influenced quite strongly by the presence of people who emigrated to England, emigrated to London from Cyprus and the Greek-speaking population. If you go 3 or 4 miles down the road, you'll find an area where Turkish-speaking Cypriots migrants from Turkish-speaking communities in Cyprus, they came to a different part of London. People will tend to separate themselves out, even if they're quite small preferences. And this time, the pattern of this development in the game of life, or in this computer program, is very sensitive to the initial conditions. If we do start with 30% alive, the pattern will die out almost immediately. If we start with 70% alive, the live cells will dominate completely. It's very sensitive to initial conditions, so that by changing the rules, we can understand the model will demonstrate some features that are of interest to us. The game of life is interesting because it's unpredictable, it's perfectly deterministic, it's what happens is a direct consequence of simple rules and an original pattern, but it's unpredictable and it is very insensitive to initial conditions. It manages itself to get itself to the same final condition, similar final condition every time. Other patterns, other rules are not in the same way. I understand John Conway fiddled around with this until he got the rules that he thought were the most interesting. So we have to thank him for having laboured over that question of producing a model that illustrates comparison, illustrates many of the themes that we're interested in comparison. Comparison, yes, it's very simple. It happens as soon as you start talking. It's very straightforward. But be careful. If you're going to do comparison for research purposes, you need to be rigorous and you need to explain exactly what you're asking your readers to look at, exactly where you expect them to find it, and show them what it means to you in terms of your understanding of what is going on.